Big socialist YouTuber Second Thought made a video a few months back discussing the reason why the US government will never run out of money. In it, he explains that the deficit hawks, who harp on and on about the debt ceiling and the need to cut back on social spending in order to balance the budget, are operating on a massive red herring fallacy since America has the ability to regulate and control its own money supply. He also outlines the blatant hypocrisy of the mainstream American right wing that constantly belabors the point of how expensive various social services are that work to the benefit of the public, but then when it comes to the military or corporate welfare or Wall Street bailouts, that it is perfectly acceptable for the government to step in and write a blank check giving these entities whatever they want. The central point here is that it's not actually about the available money. It's about what we as a society are willing to allocate our resources to. And since the US government is bankrolled by the wealthy elite, the state will, by extension, allocate resources in accordance to their needs over the needs of the general public. This is why we seemingly have infinite money and resources for the military or corporate subsidies, but then when it comes to anything that goes to the benefit of American workers, resources run artificially scarce. The reason for this is because, once again, we live in a capitalist society for and by the rich, and due to this system's periodic economic turbulence, the capitalists are poised to impose greater and greater austerity cutbacks to social programs over time in order to compensate for lost profitability. And I'm going to leave it at that because this is not what this video is actually about. The following is a streamlined summary of JT's explanation of modern monetary theory.
What I'd like to explain today is that government spending isn't a bad thing. There's no debt your kids will have to pay back, nor is it reckless spending by well-intentioned but ultimately kinda careless bureaucrats. We can afford to pay for social programs like universal healthcare, and welfare, and new infrastructure, and high-speed rail, and sustainable energy, because government spending is A, not funded by taxes, so more government spending doesn't mean less money in your pocket, and B, there is no hard limit on government spending so long as the government spends money on something. The real constraint on government spending isn't money, that it has an unlimited supply. The constraint is physical resources. The federal government of the US has currency sovereignty. It has a fiat currency, meaning its currency isn't tied to anything like gold, and it issues debt mainly in said currency. When the government spends more than it taxes, this is called a deficit. This deficit is a gap the government fills at the moment through debt. And the US gets this debt by selling bonds. These bonds are held by a lot of people, including some foreign governments. But the vast majority are held by Americans, the government itself, and the Federal Reserve, which will often buy back bonds as a way to introduce more currency into the economy. We call this debt. But it's more like an accounting system for the government and a way for it to give some value to its currency, by making sure people want to store their wealth in dollars instead of something else. Unlike you and me, the government will always be able to pay this debt back, to return the money on the IOUs it created, because it's issued everything in dollars which the government can produce in unlimited supply. The government can never go bankrupt. It's not waiting for more gold to come in or something. The government debt is just a way the government monitors and holds onto a part of the money supply.
This is all fine and dandy, but there is one angle of this question that I really wish that JT would have taken some time to discuss, and that is the role which imperialism plays in the First World's efficacious use of the magic money tree, along with the massive amounts of power and privilege that the United States enjoys that enable it to seamlessly violate basic economic laws of inflation and currency devaluation when it comes to creating trillions of dollars out of thin air. Why is it that America and its allies can make liberal use of the magic money tree in ways that second and third world countries cannot? Why is it that Zimbabwe or Venezuela can't just create trillions of dollars in their own respective currencies to finance their own social programs and government projects without also generating massive amounts of corresponding inflation? Why is it that when America creates trillions of dollars to bail out Wall Street, that we don't see anything resembling the kind of runaway inflation that we see in the aforementioned third world countries? In order to understand why this is, we need to understand what causes a currency to inflate in the first place, and the answer is very straightforward. In any given market, when supply cannot meet demand, inflation is a direct consequence, and within the context of money markets, when there is minimal demand for any given currency to be used as a medium of exchange, that currency's value is diminished. Conversely, if there is a very high demand for a given currency to be used as the medium of exchange, that currency's value increases, and since all money in the world today is fiat, That is to say, it is no longer backed by valuable materials such as silver or gold. The value of money in the world today has by and large become superfluous, with most currencies being primarily valued in relation to the dollar. The reason why this is the case is because the dollar is what is called a world reserve currency, while the Venezuelan bolivar is not. As a result, any given entity which seeks to exchange with dollars will have exponentially larger and far more versatile markets at their disposal in comparison to the bolivar, since the latter grants one access to Venezuelan markets exclusively, while the former grants access to markets globally. For reasons we're about to discuss, global markets and economies have all been oriented around the dollar, and so there is a virtually limitless ceiling on how many dollars that the United States can create, since there is also virtually limitless corresponding demand for the dollar to be used for investment and international trade. In order to understand why this is, we need to understand the history of fiat money and the emergent phenomenon of international dollar hegemony. Prior to World War II, most currencies around the globe upheld one version or another of a gold standard. That is to say, each and every country had to possess a reserve of gold in their vaults in order to issue paper currency. In those days, paper currency directly corresponded to a set amount of gold, and any individual who sought to exchange paper cash for gold, or gold for paper cash, could do so at any national bank of their choosing. This system of monetary economics worked well enough for the era, but like all good things, it eventually had to come to an end. After the global economy crashed following the stock panic of the late 1920s, the ways in which capitalism was organized at the time had ceased to be valid, as the global economy had come to a grinding halt. And it would be from here on out that in a broader effort to save the system, that the US government would carry out a series of policies that would see to it that the gold standard was unmade. Once Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president during the Great Depression, he sought to implement a series of reforms in the pursuit of reinvigorating the capitalist system. In order to do this, however, there were a number of serious challenges which his administration needed to overcome. The biggest issue was funding. FDR's New Deal and alphabet soup programs needed funding, but the US government was practically broke, and tax revenue was at an all-time low for the simple reason that there was virtually no taxable income being generated in America's heavily depressed economy. A third of the population was out of work, Hoovervilles were popping up left and right in every American city, and profitable investment opportunities had all but dried up, leading the capitalists to sit on their vast hoards of wealth and not spend it on anything. And you can't generate tax revenue by not spending money. So in 1933, FDR issued Executive Order 6102, a mandate which by law suspended the gold standard, and obligated everyone in the country to sell their gold to the United States government under the threat of imprisonment. In 1934, he signs the Gold Reserve Act, which legally transferred ownership of all monetary gold out in the United States to the Treasury, while at the same time prohibiting the Treasury and the banks from redeeming paper cash for gold. Additional steps were taken to deliberately devalue the dollar as to artificially drive up the price of gold while detaching the dollar from gold entirely. So while the government was forcibly confiscating as much gold as it could from the general public at a fixed cost, it was also abolishing the domestic gold standard and simultaneously turning around and selling that gold back to the native populace as well as to international consumers abroad at exorbitant markups. And that is how Franklin D. Roosevelt funded the New Deal. He began the process of decoupling the dollar from the gold standard while ripping off the general public in the process, an inconvenient fact that many self-described social democrats really need to acknowledge and come to terms with. After the end of World War II, the United States found itself in a uniquely privileged position. On one hand, the rest of the developed world was bombed back to the Stone Age, but on the other hand, the US economy and its infrastructure, thanks to its far approximation from where all of the action was taking place, was left largely intact and completely unscathed by the end of World War II. Following World War II, the communist world had expanded massively, as over a dozen countries and former territories of the former Russian Empire had fallen behind the so-called Iron Curtain. A new threat to the global capitalist order was on the horizon, while at the same time, a post-war recession began to follow suit. And so in response, the Western colonial powers understood that the global economic order must once again be restructured, and that they needed a new reserve currency in order to do so. And so the Bretton-Woods Agreement was established. The Bretton-Woods Agreement was a formal agreement amongst the First World countries which established the International Monetary Fund, made all currencies convertible to US dollars, allowed sovereign nations to interchange dollars for gold, and established the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So while the gold standard had been abolished for American consumers, countries still upheld gold standards of their own nationally, and it wasn't until 1971, when President Nixon formally prohibited countries from being able to convert their currencies to gold, that the international gold standard had truly come to an end, and the modern era of fiat money would officially begin. From here on out, there have been numerous financial policies which have been carried out to facilitate international trade on the basis of the dollar. One of these methods included the introduction of petrodollars. Petrodollars, for those of you who do not know, are dollar bills which are paid out by the United States to any oil exporting nation with a surplus in petroleum. And these aforementioned nations just so happen to be predominantly from the Middle East. From Saudi Arabia to Iraq and Iran, to Libya and Kuwait to the United Arab Emirates. These countries have a surplus in oil but a shortage in dollars, while the United States has a monopoly on the production of dollars but a never-ending demand for crude oil, not only for its own domestic population's consumption owed in large part to their hopeless addiction to the automobile, but also because the global economy as we know it today is by and large operated based off of fossil fuels. While petrodollars have been around since World War II, the policy didn't officially come into its own until Washington and the OPEC countries came to a special agreement in the mid-1970s. The architect of this agreement was none other than the late Henry Kissinger himself, may he burn in hell. Essentially, the OPEC countries would be obligated to trade their oil with the US and accept dollars as payment, and in exchange, the US would provide them with military support and political favor at the international stage. So if you're wondering how Saudi Arabia, a country that is guilty of a slew of human rights abuses, whose government was indirectly responsible for orchestrating the deadliest attack on US soil in history, can be on the Human Rights Panel of the UN and be considered a close ally to the United States, well, now you know. As it turns out, America is more than willing to betray all of its own principles and core values and overlook the crimes of its closest allies, so long as they're being sold cheap oil. Needless to say, it was thanks to this agreement that a slew of artificial demand had been generated for the US dollar, and by the 1980s, all of the OPEC countries were now trading in dollars. Bada boom, bada bang, America gets a never-ending surplus of oil, the oil-rich nations receive an influx of dollar bills which they can use to trade and grow their own economies, and dollar hegemony gets further reinforced and entrenched, which by extension further entrenches America's stranglehold on the world. It is important to note that capitalist competition extends well beyond the sphere of private firms battling one another for market share. Much like an eldritch horror from H.P. Lovecraft, its tendrils grasp and penetrate deeper and deeper into the earth over time, violating everything that we love and perverting everything that we hold dear to our hearts. From competition within classes to competition between classes, from competition within nations to competition between nations, and even competition between differing forms of currency. In the world today, every nation has a central bank of its own which is responsible for regulating a country's money supply. However, there is a problem. Paper money is now fiat, backed by utterly nothing but human confidence and imagination. This is a big deal because you need a theory of value in order to justify the validity of your currency. You need something to back it up, and to stimulate market demand for its use as a medium of exchange. Otherwise, a country is at risk of suffering from a catastrophic financial crisis brought on as a result of their currency coming under attack on the foreign exchange market. And so for most countries who do regular business with the International Monetary Fund, they opt to have their respective currencies valued, aka pegged, in relation to one of the world's reserve currencies, be it the dollar, the European euro, the Chinese yuan, etc. And while alternatives do exist, most countries opt to set the exchange rate of their currencies in relation to the dollar. In other words, their currencies are pegged to the dollar, so to speak. As a result, their financial systems can be kept stable so long as they are able to defend the peg, or, in other words, justify the value of their currency in relation to the dollar. In order for that to happen, there must once again be market demand for their currency to be used as a medium of exchange. Somebody must be making purchases and sales with that money, and that money has to be interchangeable with the dollar at any given time. In the wake of this phenomenon, there are a couple of magic tricks that countries utilize to defend the peg and keep their financial systems stable. One method is to simply buy back their own currency, keeping stockpiles of dollars reserved on hand within their national treasuries. In doing this, the state is able to generate artificial demand for its currency by acting as a customer for it, and by extension artificially inflating its value. Another method by which nations sustain their currency and financial system is through the acquisition of American debt. During this process, there are three major actors involved. That is the second or third world country in question, the United States of America, and the International Monetary Fund. Countries will enter trade agreements with the IMF with the intention of getting set up with a customer for their currency. The IMF, in this instance, acts as a kind of middleman on behalf of the imperialists, whom will broker a deal between the aforementioned poor countries and the United States. On one hand, the poor countries need a customer for their currency, while on the other hand, America needs a customer for its debt, and so the country in question, or in this case the creditor, will utilize its central bank to create money out of thin air and then use this money to purchase United States Treasury bonds. These Treasury bonds can be best thought of as glorified IOUs, redeemable in US dollars of course, which the United States is obligated to pay back to the buyer after a certain period of time. But since these foreign currencies are inherently undervalued owed to their lack of demand at the international stage, on top of the fact that said currencies are typically pegged beneath the dollar, what these countries are doing in using their sovereign currencies to purchase US debt is effectively loaning money to the United States at an artificially low interest rate, providing the US government with an endless supply of money to deficit spend, finance its entitlements, infrastructure, governmental programs, maintain the upkeep of its massive military, etc. And so year by year, decade by decade, the more America's debt climbs, the more debt becomes available for wholesale on the world market. The more the United States can deficit spend, the more debt that it generates, etc. And these are the reasons why the United States and its allies cannot and will not ever face a balance of payments crisis or a currency crisis akin to what happened in Southeast Asia in the late 1980s, or the Soviet Union in the late 1980s under Mikhail Gorbachev. Through its manipulation of the dollar, and the world's dependency on the dollar for international trade, the United States holds massive amounts of sway over global geopolitics, and by extension the world's resources. This is the reason why when countries go to the IMF or World Bank for economic assistance, the developmental schemes that get implemented are nefariously designed by the latter to maximize the rate of exploitation on the country's population while only working to the benefit of a tiny minority of corrupt rich elites constituting its leadership. And whenever countries receive economic assistance from the IMF and World Bank, they will be immediately ordered to privatize all of their utilities and publicly owned assets, lax their environmental regulations, abolish the workers' unions, strip away all rights and entitlements and protections for their workers, and allow the US to build a few military bases on their land. And this situation doesn't just work to the benefit of the transnational corporations and the banks at the expense of the third world working class, it also works to the benefit of the domestic working population of the first world. It's the reason why we enjoy an abundance of cheap electronics and consumer goods. It's the reason why we enjoy the luxury of having every single individual adult in the country owning and driving an automobile. It's the reason why we get to have a service economy while all the real manufacturing is done abroad. The reason why America can deficit spend as much as it wants without consequence, etc. The fact of the matter is that America and the First World control most of the planet's resources, and consumers within the First World do benefit from this imperialist economic arrangement, even if it only is to a very tangential degree. And so to wrap things up, Second Thought is 100% correct when he says that it's never been about the money, but the available resources, and that we can deficit spend on free healthcare and tuition-free college and affordable housing as much as we desire. The magic money tree does work, and the reason why the magic money tree works is because imperialism works. But in order for the ultimate emancipation of the proletariat to be realized, imperialism has to come to an end. This means treating the second and third world with actual equality, instead of as disposable profit-making machines, which would entail a value transfer in the opposite direction of what is currently taking place right now. All of this begs the question, of course, are First Worlders willing to give up their privileged position at the global stage to make the necessary sacrifices at an individual level in the short term in order for the ultimate liberation and emancipation of all of humanity to be realized in the long term? Are they willing to give back the stolen land? Can they tolerate not having access to avocados in the winter? Are they comfortable with not being able to buy a new smartphone or a new television set every other year? Would they be willing to pay more money in taxes to fund a robust mass public transit system and governmental programs centered around the benefit of their fellow man? Do they mind paying a little extra money for their cheap consumer goods imported from Latin America in a broader effort to subsidize those countries and enable their economic development in exchange for spending centuries enabling ours? I shall leave you to come to your own conclusions and derive your own answers to these questions on your own time, viewer, but one thing is clear. You cannot both be a principled socialist and an imperialist at the same time, and we shouldn't settle for anything less. To believe otherwise is to be a blatant social chauvinist who doesn't genuinely care about workers' emancipation, but only wishes to see to it that there is a more equitable distribution of the spoils of imperialist plunder back on the home front. The good old social fascism, if you will. The good old social imperialism, if you will. Anyways, that's all I have to say for now. I hope this has been informative.